Hello and welcome to the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. I'm Mark Rees, and on each episode, I investigate a different, weird, and wonderful subject. And on this episode, we are going to explore a haunted National Trust property that, like a scene from a Gothic horror novel, trapped its occupiers inside. It cast them into perpetual darkness, and when the paranormal activity began, it culminated with the materialization of a ghostly figure with a familiar face. And so, to begin at the beginning, and for this episode we are heading to lovely Beddgelert, the Gwynedd village in the north of Wales, in the shadow of Wales's highest mountains, the wonderful Snowdonian mountains, which, as well as being the setting of this particularly Gothic tale, is also the setting of one of Wales's most famous legends and, incidentally, one of my most popular episodes. One of the very first episodes I recorded a few years ago now was about the legend of a dog called Gelert. And I know it's a popular episode from looking at the stats and from talking to listeners, because people tell me they've returned to that episode again and again, and they've also cursed me for destroying their childhoods, because in that episode I revealed the truth about the story. Now, if you didn't catch that episode, or if you aren't familiar with the legend of Gelert, fear not, it doesn't affect this episode at all, which is about a terrifying haunting, not a legendary dog, but a very quick recap just to get everyone up to speed. But the name Beddgelert, the name of this village, this legendary village, translates as Gelert's grave. Bedd is Welsh for grave, and Gelert is seemingly Gelert, although maybe it's not. I won't go into that now. You can check out the earlier episode for the full explanation, but for our purposes, Beddgelert translates as Gelert's grave. And according to the legend, and there is a memorial in the village with this story on, so it must be true, but according to the legend, in the 13th century, Llywelyn, the Prince of North Wales, left his dog, his faithful hound Gelert, to look after his son and heir while he went out hunting. But when he returned, he found the dog smeared in blood. It was dripping from its jaws, and his son's cot was overturned and also bloodstained just like the dog. Now, Llywelyn assumed Gelert had attacked and killed his son, pulled out his sword, pierced Gelert in the side, and as the dog let out a howl of pain, Llywelyn heard the cry of a baby alongside it. He soon discovered his son was alive and well on the floor, and lying next to him was the body of a great wolf. It turns out the reason Gelert was covered in blood is because he had been protecting the child from this wolf. The whole thing was a tragic misunderstanding, and he had killed the dog by mistake, and he lamented it for the rest of his life. Now, you might be thinking life would have been much easier if Llywelyn had just gotten a babysitter in the first place, but of course that wouldn't be such a good legend. There probably wouldn't be a statue of Gelert in Beddgelert today as a result. But as mentioned, there is a bit more, there's a heck of a lot more to the story than that recap. If you'd like to know more, please check out the earlier episode. For now, we are going to crack on with the haunting, which takes place on the outskirts of the village, and all the best, or maybe that should be all the worst, but all the best hauntings take place on the outskirts of places. These are the places that are a little bit liminal. They're a little bit in between places. They are on the edges. And in this case, the place we are heading to that is on the outskirts is a sprawling estate called Craflwyn. Craflwyn, the Craflwyn estate. Now, just to be clear, this is one of those places that sadly I have not visited in person yet. I've been to Beddgelert, of course, but I have not had the chance to go to Craflwyn yet. I hope to change that soon. Maybe they'll invite me after hearing this episode. Or maybe they'll ban me after hearing this episode. Who knows? Because what I find so remarkable about this haunting is that it was brought to my attention in the first place by the National Trust themselves. All of the information on this episode, all of the spooky accounts, and there are some very spooky accounts, came courtesy of the National Trust in their freely available books and literature. And the reason I find this so remarkable, very commendable in fact actually, I do take my hat off to the National Trust for making all of this information so readily available. Because for organisations like the National Trust, and for my international listeners, just in case you aren't familiar, but the National Trust is a charity that does some fantastic work maintaining historical places in Britain. A lot of old houses and gardens and tourist destinations are cared for by them, maintained by them. You could say saved for the nation by them. If it wasn't for them, many of these places might not be with us. And the reason I find this so remarkable is that tourist destinations like the National Trust and other similar places that really are aimed at a family market like to keep their ghost stories to a PG level, let's say. I mean, not quite in a Disney sense where it's Mickey's not scary at all Halloween party type stuff going on. They do like to put the ghost stories out there, but usually it's around Halloween time, and they rarely go beyond the level of a white lady floating around the house. Maybe there's a headless horseman in the trees outside, but nothing that's going to send people home with nightmares, unless they are specifically catered for adults. But those with a family audience rarely go down the route of talking about the more terrifying ghosts that might actually make people think twice about visiting. If you're planning a lovely family day out in a stately home and you discover there's a poltergeist there that might throw bricks at your head, maybe, just maybe, you might think twice about taking the kids along. So, full credit and full thanks to the National Trust for making this information available and for making this episode possible. And talking about the National Trust being lovely, long-term listeners might remember that a few Halloweens ago now, I did record a live ghost hunt from another National Trust property at Deneva at Newton Hall with my good friend Ronnie. Again, you can go and check that out afterwards if you'd like. For now, we are going to dive into the hauntings of Craflwyn Hall. Now, the National Trust took over the property in more recent times after it had been sitting there in quite a dilapidated state for decades. But our history lesson begins back in the 19th century. And it was towards the end of the 19th century that the land was inherited by Llywelyn England Sidney Parry, a man of some wealth and standing who built a suitably grand and fancy country house to show off with, to fill his guests with awe and envy, and by all accounts it did just that. And this big fancy new show-off country house was called Craflwyn Hall. Craflwyn Hall, the epicenter of the haunting that will soon follow. Now, Craflwyn Hall was indeed very grand, very fancy, and it flourished until 1895. But the problem is that successive owners just didn't have the same wealth that he had. Nobody was rich enough to maintain it in the way that he had. The world was changing, and even the wealthiest of owners struggled to maintain not just this extravagant home, but the vast area of land surrounding it, this entire estate. Slowly but surely, throughout the 20th century, Craflwyn Hall deteriorated. But it was still a very attractive proposal for somebody with a bit of money who was looking for a fixer-upper, let's say. Somebody who's wealthy, but maybe not wealthy enough to spend ridiculous sums on such a place in perfect condition, and they fancy sorting out Craflwyn. And it just so happens that a suitable owner did come along. A very lucky man called David Nemro, or very unlucky. Again, depending on how you want to look at it, there are two ways of looking at a lot of things on this episode. But David was a taxi driver from just over the border in Manchester. And in the 1960s, he struck it lucky when he won the pools and decided to live out his dreams. And the pools, if you aren't familiar with the pools, refers to the bet-in pools, which, much like the lottery, If you get it right, you win a lot of money. He'd won all this money, and he had always dreamed of living in the mountains of Snowdonia. So what does he do? He's become rich overnight. He's not going to settle for some pokey 2-up, 2-down cottage. He is going to buy himself a country house, and he buys Craflwyn. And to begin with, well, for quite some time actually, he and his wife were very happy and very comfortable there. In fact, it wasn't until the 1990s, and there's no specific dates here, but we're looking at roughly 30 years later. It was only in the 1990s that this constant drain on their finances began to tell. Because even though he'd struck it big, even though he'd won the pools, there still wasn't enough money to keep Craflwyn running smoothly forever. And so, in an attempt to save a few pounds, they decided to lock up some of the less frequently used rooms. Rather than wasting time and money keeping bedrooms and other rooms they never used fit for a king, they decided to cut back until they were left effectively with 3 rooms to live in. The kitchen, the living room, and a bedroom. They don't mention a bathroom here. I'm assuming they would have wanted a bathroom as well, but they've got the kitchen, the living room, and a bedroom as the 3 rooms they spend most of their time in. Now, they also decided to cut back on expenses with the garden. In fact, they cut back so much they did nothing with the garden. It was totally uncared for. And the more overgrown it became, the gloomier the house became. Because these plants were growing and overhanging, blocking out the sun, and casting the house into darker and darker shadows. And I can just imagine it. It's like a scene from the Triffids, these big giant plants outside the house, looming over it, these menacing plants that block out the sun. And this is why I refer to it as sounding like something from a Gothic horror novel, because they are living in what was once a grand, stately home, but now they are confined to a small section of it, and even at the height of summer, their house was cast in dark shadow. And it was under these circumstances, having dreamt of living in a very big house in the country, just like in a Blur song, it was under these circumstances that the house was no longer jolly. It was shrinking, it was repressive, and the paranormal activity began. The paranormal activity began, and at first, it was just noises. Well, I say just, there was nothing just about it. At first, it was noises, unwanted noises, that we heard on a nightly basis. And they were emanating from the locked rooms. So all of those rooms they'd locked up to save money were now making sounds, terrifying sounds that reminded them that those rooms were still there, as if there were prisoners trapped inside those rooms, banging to be released. And those sounds sent chills down the spines of the couple who heard them night after night after night. Of course, the more they banged, the less likely the couple were to open those doors, to release these spirits, as it were, whether that's metaphorically or not. But whatever was going on inside, they wanted to keep it inside. The more they banged, the more the couple retreated further and further into their own little world, keeping to themselves, making themselves as small a part of the house as possible. Now, things really escalated one day when Mrs. Nemra was sleeping in the kitchen. Why was she sleeping in the kitchen? Well, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe because she'd had no sleep the night before with all that banging going on. But she was sleeping in the kitchen and awoke suddenly with a start to find, to quote, a handsome woman in a floor-length red silk Victorian gown standing beside her, which keeps this Gothic theme going as well, I think. But this was to quote again, a handsome woman in a floor-length red silk Victorian gown, which she said was all shimmery and then slowly dissolved into thin air. So this Victorian woman, this handsome woman, materialized all shimmery and then before her very eyes disappeared once more. So, after all that banging, she had now seen a full-bodied apparition, and the spirit's face had been one that she recognized. It looked just like a portrait that was hanging up in one of the locked rooms. The portrait of Mrs. Parry, the wife of the original owner who had spent so much money making Craflwyn the impressive house that it was, but at the same time totally unmanageable for future generations. And she was the hostess to many a lavish gathering. And after hosting so many grand parties in her lifetime, she was seemingly still making a noise late into the night, albeit in a more paranormal way than a partying way. And this begs the question, had she in some way escaped from this room? Was she in some way showing her displeasure with the way this property was being maintained? Was she showing her displeasure at the way they were treating her pride and joy? Well, whatever the reason, perhaps unsurprisingly, the Nemros were not there for much longer. Whether it was financial reasons, supernatural reasons, a combination of the two, or something else entirely, they soon left. And in 1994, with the house at its lowest ebb, after years and years of the estate growing wild with triffids running all over the place, and the house going virtually untouched except for those 3 main rooms, this is when the National Trust came to the rescue. And a particularly keen young volunteer, sadly we don't have a name, but a keen young volunteer who was in search of conservation work with the National Trust was allocated the property. And he was tasked with working in the daytime, mainly, working the grounds by day, but he also doubled up as security during the night, if for no other reason than the simple fact that he was sleeping on site. He was living there, he was sleeping there, therefore he acted as security. Now, he presumably had his pick of rooms, maybe not all of the rooms, some of them might have been quite a mess by this point, they might even have been dangerous, I don't know, but considering the state of the place from what we know, he decided to sleep on a camp bed in the kitchen, one of the few habitable rooms left by the previous occupants. They had been using it right up until the end, and that is where he decided he was going to spend the night. But even there, he was unable to get any rest. He was unable to get any rest because, and this might sound familiar, he heard loud noises banging in the night, which seemed to be coming from deep within the house. They ensured he was kept wide awake, and if that wasn't enough, he was also overcome by, to quote again, a sensation of creeping horror, as though some malevolent force was prowling the house. So if loud noises weren't bad enough, there was a sensation of creeping horror as though some malevolent force was prowling the house, which I think is enough to keep anyone awake at night. Especially if you've just started a new job that involves sleeping overnight in a giant, creepy, rundown old mansion on your own. So, what does he do? Well, as a new young volunteer, he has a chat with the property manager, who does his best to put his mind at ease, and they insisted it was only natural to hear such noises and experience such feelings in a ramshackle old building like Craflwyn was at the time. The experienced manager just said, look, this is what happens in these old places. You get used to those creaks and those noises with time. But nevertheless, you can't have young members of staff getting freaked out as soon as they start. So he agreed to stop by to see him that evening to check up on him. And when he did so, he found the volunteer in one heck of a state, frankly. He arrived and saw that the volunteer was scared out of his wits. And the manager themselves would soon be forced to eat their words, because they said, to quote, I have never felt such a spooky atmosphere in my life. The whole house seemed somehow poisonous, decaying. The volunteer was sitting bolt upright on his camp bed, rigid with fear, not daring to close his eyes for an instant. which is one heck of a description from somebody who just hours earlier was trying to reassure the volunteer to say, look, there's nothing to worry about. It's just creaks in an old house. It's just your imagination. Now it was something that terrified them, that chilled them to the bone. And as a result, unsurprisingly again, as with the previous occupants, the volunteer packed his bags and made a sharp exit the next morning. Now, that brings us to the end of the ghostly accounts, and as I mentioned, I haven't sadly visited the property myself, but the good news is, from what I've been told, if that young volunteer were to return to Craflwyn today, and incidentally, I do hope that young volunteer had a spectacular career afterwards. I hope they were moved to somewhere a little less haunted afterwards, but if they were to return to the hall today, by all accounts, they would find the estate totally transformed and they would be in for a much more pleasant experience because more than £1 million was spent on renovation work. And now a real sense of happiness has returned to the land, a happiness that maybe hadn't been felt there since those giddy heydays of the Victorian age. And the big difference between now and then, of course, is that while that happiness was derived from spending, frankly, an obscene amount of money, nowadays it's done in a much more sustainable and realistic fashion. Which I'm sure means, in the hands of the National Trust, nothing but happy days ahead for the future of the estate. And on that happy note, we've reached the end of another episode of the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. If you have visited Craflwyn Hall yourself, or even better, if you've stayed there, it would be great to hear from you. If you have any stories to share, or even if you don't, confirming that the place is a place of joy now, please get in touch. If you enjoyed this episode and you haven't already, please consider pressing the subscribe button. And if you really enjoyed it, you can support the podcast by rating it, reviewing it, telling all your friends about it. And if you really, really, really enjoyed it and you want to help keep it on the air going forward, you can treat me to a coffee via my website, which is always very much appreciated. If you'd like more Ghosts and Folklore, you can follow me on social media. And as well as this podcast, I've also written a number of books about similar weird and wonderful subjects, which are available from all good bookshops, offline and on. The most recent one being Paranormal Swansea and Gower, which I launched or will launch depending on how I should word this. There's a bit of Doctor Who time travelling going on here because I am recording this episode on the Tuesday. I will be launching the book on what is to me tomorrow, the Wednesday, in Waterstones in Swansea, but this episode is released on the Thursday, so as far as I'm concerned, I'm launching the book tomorrow. As far as anyone listening to this is concerned, I launched it yesterday. That's assuming you're listening to this on the day it is released. If you're listening to it on any other date, then you're going to have to get the calendar out and work it out for yourself, I'm afraid. All of which is a rather confusing and long-winded way of just saying I have just released Paranormal Swansea and Gower. And anyway, back to wrapping up this episode. And if you'd like to know more about the legend of Gellet, or if you'd like to check out that live ghost hunt I did from the other National Trust property, feel free to go digging around in the archives for all the other episodes I've recorded. And on that note, it just leaves me to say thank you very much for listening. Diolch yn fawr iawn am wrando. I've been Mark Rees. This has been my Ghosts and Folklore podcast, beaming to you from Wales to the world. And remember, if you are invited to investigate a haunted house, a very big house in the country, sometimes it's best to just roll with it. Until next time. Nosta! Thank you.